And welcome to this virtual event on inclusive adaptation, a benefit multiplier for climate action and women, peace, and security. I'm Elaine Revere, and I direct the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And we're pleased to have over 600 participants joining us on our Zoom platform today, and many more on Facebook. Welcome to each and every one of you. It's almost the end of summer, and it's been a summer of record-breaking soaring temperatures, growing numbers of destructive wildfires, extreme droughts, and lower water levels in rivers and lakes. We're also seeing more extreme rainstorms and terrible flooding. Farmers are being driven from their land that is no longer arable and can no longer provide a livelihood, often leading to displacement, even sparking conflict over diminishing resources. As one newspaper headlined this summer, summer has turned into a season of disaster. And the United Nations Secretary General called the worsening situation code red for humanity. Women are the key providers of food, water, and energy in many parts of the world, and they are disproportionately affected by the increasingly severe weather and struggling to adapt to these challenges. Often they are struggling with overlapping challenges of insecurity, poverty, conflict, gender equality, and state fragility. Yet, at the same time, women are leading climate solutions in renewable energy and regenerative agriculture and local adaptation efforts. We often refer to climate change as a threat multiplier, which it is. Today, we want to focus on the role of women in adaptation as a benefit multiplier. We are thrilled to launch our Georgetown Institute's newest climate report today. It draws key links between climate change and women, peace, and security, and shows how meaningful inclusion of women in local level climate adaptation efforts can strengthen responses to climate change, gender equality, and security. And you can find the link for the report in our chat box. We will shortly hear from leading experts and practitioners whose work has been featured in the report as examples of best practices. But a note before we begin, we've already received many pre-submitted questions from you in our audience, but you can have the opportunity and take it to continue to send questions in using the Q&A feature on your screen. Now to begin. It is my pleasure to introduce the lead author of the report, Clara Chu. Clara is a Hillary Rodham Clinton Fellow at the Georgetown Institute and has been an integral part of our climate team. She will give us an overview of the report and share some of the key findings. Clara, take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Ambassador Revere, and thank you to the distinguished panelists and guests who have joined today to launch this report. Climate change is a women, peace, and security issue. To date, research on the gender and security impacts of climate change has primarily focused on the disproportionate risks and vulnerabilities women and other marginalized groups experience. Far less attention has been paid to the benefits of women's inclusion in climate action. This report contributes to that gap in knowledge by promoting the role of women in local level adaptation within the agriculture and energy sectors as a pathway to greater peace and security and better climate outcomes. The field of women, peace, and security affirms the critical role of women in addressing security threats and calls for women's equal participation in conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and peace-building efforts. Climate change is increasingly recognized as a threat to peace and security. It drives insecurity through direct negative impacts on environmental systems, such as droughts, flooding, and wildfires, and through secondary risks, such as political instability, population displacements, poverty, and hunger. Many countries experiencing conflict or humanitarian crises are also experiencing the impacts of climate change. And where these dynamics are overlapping, climate impacts can fuel conflict dynamics, violence, food insecurity, and forced displacement. This means a climate lens is absolutely essential to effectively respond to the security threats women and others are facing today. Just as the impacts of conflict are not gender neutral, the same is true of the impacts of climate change. Climate change is widely understood as a risk multiplier, in part because it entrenches pre-existing vulnerabilities and patterns of discrimination. For women who have fewer resources and less decision-making power, it is more difficult to absorb and recover from climate shocks. However, analysis from our 2021 to 2022 Women, Peace, and Security Index found that where women are doing better, countries are also better positioned to address climate change. This is why addressing drivers of gender inequality is crucial to effective climate response. So if climate change is a risk multiplier, the report shows how the meaningful inclusion of women in climate action could be a benefit multiplier that simultaneously strengthens climate response, gender equality, and security. Around the world, communities on the front lines of the climate crisis are already struggling to cope with its impacts. The report emphasizes inclusive, concrete actions to promote the role of women in local level adaptation and shows how inclusive climate responses could address overlapping forms of insecurity. Much of the policy discourse on climate action focuses on the urgent need for mitigation or drastically reducing greenhouse gas emissions. These efforts are primarily the responsibility of countries and corporations that are producing large-scale emissions. While mitigation efforts are needed to reduce the severity and frequency of future climate impacts, adaptation strategies, the focus of the report, are needed now to address current climate impacts and should be built from the bottom up. Adaptation remains under-resourced and underemphasized in climate action, but it has some of the strongest links to women, peace, and security. Not only does adaptation directly benefit women's daily lives and enhance community security, but women's inclusion in local level climate adaptation also fosters greater economic empowerment and decision-making power, as well as community stability and resilience. The report specifically focuses on local level adaptation interventions within the agriculture and energy sectors. Not only have these two sectors historically generated a large share of negative climate impacts, but growing investment in climate smart agriculture and in clean energy makes these sectors particularly strategic entry points. For example, in 2021, COP26 launched the Large-Scale Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate, which has already garnered billions of dollars of funding for investments in climate smart agriculture by 2025. And renewable energy investments accounted for an estimated 70% of worldwide power generation investments in 2021. So as resources are channeled into these sectors, we must ensure that women and girls benefit equally from these investments and that these investments work to disrupt cycles of gender inequality. The report highlights several projects within each of these two sectors that serve as examples of what successful gender-responsive adaptation interventions can look like in practice. Based on these projects and a review of available literature, the report lays out several recommendations. The first recommendation is to address barriers to inclusion to ensure that women have equal access to project participation and resources. Gender analysis and community-based needs assessments should be used by project designers and implementers to identify barriers and incentives for engaging women in climate smart agriculture practices and clean energy use, and to inform project design. The second recommendation is to increase women's access to information, education, and technology. For example, a project spotlighted in the report in Gujarat, India, involved a voice-based agro-advisory information system on weather, pests, and markets, which allowed women farmers, regardless of their literacy level, to adapt to the impacts of climate change-induced weather events, and guided women farmers to make strategic agricultural decisions based on future crop prices. The third recommendation is to provide training and support for women as entrepreneurs and design consultants. This can improve financial security, ensure that products meet community needs, and increase the likelihood that the technology will be adopted, particularly by women consumers. For example, in Nigeria, a failure to consult women in the design of clean cook stoves that were intended to reduce black carbon and enhance health resulted in a product that was not big enough or sturdy enough to feed large families. So women did not use the stoves. Alternatively, by centering women in the design efforts, such mistakes can be avoided and products can be designed that are actually useful to women and better for the environment. The fourth recommendation is to address critical gaps in knowledge through additional research and case studies. Case studies and data related to women's contributions to climate change adaptation efforts are severely lacking. More research is needed to inform gender-responsive interventions, to identify best practices that can be replicated and scaled up, and to promote investments in inclusive approaches that generate impact. Additional case studies from diverse geographical areas, including countries experiencing both conflict and climate impacts, are also needed to create a richer evidence base. The final recommendation is to obtain buy-in and mobilize resources for gender-responsive, community-centered climate solutions. Key stakeholders, including governments, the private sector, multilateral bodies, and civil society, must work together with those most impacted by the climate crisis to create collective solutions and comprehensive responses. The voice-based agro-advisory system in Gujarat I mentioned earlier shows how technical experts and the private sector can partner to create better outcomes. Innovative solutions and collective efforts must be matched with adequate resources to generate impact, and dedicated funding mechanisms are needed to ensure that these resources reach women. In short, we cannot address the climate crisis without women's meaningful participation. Investing in women is not only the right thing to do, it is also the smart thing to do. Inclusive approaches to local level climate adaptation will lead to better outcomes, accelerate progress toward gender equality, and create a more secure and just planet for all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Clara. I know it's not easy to be able to digest a report of this magnitude into such a great summary that gives us a good sense of the report. You'll stay with us for the Q&A, so there'll probably be many questions coming to you on the specifics of the report. Let's look now at some of those local interventions that Clara mentioned in the report by turning first to Lydia Wanjiku Kabandi, who is the CEO of Lensational, a global social enterprise that works to elevate the voices of underrepresented women through storytelling and photography, and ensure that they are included in decision-making. Lydia has earned recognition as a young leader in her country, Kenya, and has led a number of climate justice solutions. Lydia, it's so great to have you with us today. I want to ask you, you've been on the front lines of the climate crisis. Why, in your own experience, have you seen how inclusive adaptation matters? And can you give us some examples from the interventions and projects that you've been engaged in that have been making a difference?
Sure. Thank you so much, Ambassador Milan, for this opportunity. I am so delighted to be joining my fellow remarkable panelists for the launch of this report. And a really great breakdown by Clara there. I agree, such a nice way to summarize such a comprehensive report. As you've mentioned, I work with Lensational, and over the years of working with women from such diverse backgrounds, where we aim to bring forward the voices of women whose stories and whose voices would otherwise not be heard, either due to their geographical location, socioeconomic backgrounds, amongst other barriers, and not only to be heard, but to be told in these women's very own perspectives using visual storytelling. And the way that we do this is by equipping the women with skills and tools for photography storytelling so that they can document and transmit their lives using photo stories. And over the years of working with these women from very diverse backgrounds, what we began to notice is a thread within their stories that drew out the kind of intimate relationship that they have with their environments, and how slight changes in this dynamic affected their lives significantly, and casting a foreshadow of how vulnerable their environments and communities are at large. But even so, tucked within these stories were the inventive ways that women were coming up to cope with these challenges. And having observed that over the years, we made a decision that we wanted to be more deliberate in dedicating our time and efforts to reaching more voices of women who are at the front lines of climate change. And one way that we're doing this is through a partnership with the National Adaptation Plan Global Network. And the way that we have been working together with the National Adaptation Plan Global Network is that they have been providing us and facilitating us through the Global Affairs Canada with the capacity to deliver photography and storytelling workshops to the groups of women who we work with here in Kenya and in Ghana. And additionally, providing us with the access to the governments and policymakers that it works with in making sure that their national adaptation plan processes are more inclusive and gender responsive. So a really good alignment in values between us. And the intention for this partnership is that the women that we then train develop stories, photo stories, that form the basis for dialogue with decision makers towards a shared understanding of what the effects of climate change are on the women's lives and the adaptation priorities for their communities. And from this, we have observed such a remarkable success and reception from policymakers within these countries to continue learning and hearing from the women and their communities using this approach. In Kenya, particularly, one of the action items in Kenya's current National Climate Change Action Plan is to foster capacity development and knowledge management through a climate resource center that hosts Kenya's climate change information and knowledge. And the photo stories that we have developed in Kenya will now be forming part of the information hosted in this resource center. And I think that that is such a profound testament to the promise that this approach holds in enabling policymakers and funders to meaningfully engage with these populations of women and their communities. In addition to this, from the images that the women develop, they are able to sell them through our online gallery and receive commissioned assignments, which enhances their ability to be resilient through income generation. One of the questions that we often receive is why photography and why should the women tell their stories? And the best way I can possibly explain this is by sharing an anecdote of something that I observed. In March, when we wrapped up the pilot project here in Kenya, we held a policy workshop and exhibition to bring together the women and policymakers in Kenya for a very a heart-to-heart discussion and dialogue over the stories that the women had developed. And I recall as the guests were arriving, I was so nervous because everybody seemed very serious. I was aware that there are other priorities and places that people would be at this time. And I remember wondering how receptive this process would be. But what I profoundly recall is that after the sessions, the demeanor of everybody had mellowed down. there was a lot of exchange, direct exchange and conversations between the policymakers and the women. And there was more empathy within the room. They lingered longer to look and absorb these images and ask the women more questions. And I think that this speaks to the power of this medium. There has been a lot of emphasis on the need to listen with our hearts and minds. And I couldn't think of a better way that could articulate this than that very experience. Yeah, and that has been amazing to watch and amazing to be part of.
Well, you know, what you described is clearly also a lesson in empowerment, capacity building, and really having strong responses that make a difference. I'm wondering, would you be able to say in a few sentences what your recommendations might be to our audience based on your experience in this realm?
Sure, I can recommend. I believe that an approach such as what Lensational has is a recommendation on itself, that from our experience, what we have learned, and I think what has been evident to observe, is that there seems to be a willingness on both policymakers and funders and different stakeholders to hear from the citizens. And there is also need for women to reach these audiences. The question often is, how do we tie the two together? What's the bridge between the two together? And I think that the approach that we use is one way that can bridge this gap that exists between different stakeholders and the women. One thing that has been interesting to learn from the women that we work with is that although they're often the ones who are affected, they often are not included in these dialogues and in these discussions. And even the language that they speak, how they speak about climate change, they don't talk about carbon emissions, they don't talk about all these. The way they talk about climate change is in, this is how I experience it, and this is how I am dealing with it. And photography storytelling brings a bridge where policymakers, stakeholders, and other interested parties who are working towards climate justice, and the women who speak a completely different language in terms of climate experience, are able to share a similar language, a language that speaks more from empathy and relating from a human level, as opposed to all the jargons that exist. And I believe that this definitely is one of my strongest recommendations of how we can hear more and we can tap more into the voices of these women and get to understand what their experiences are.
Well, thank you, Lydia. We're going to go now from the example you just heard from the Lensational work that's going on to adaptation funds. Resources are a critical issue in this area, of course, and to Saliha Dokbardzik, who is a senior climate change specialist with the Adaptation Fund. She's at the forefront of the fund's projects that help vulnerable communities to adapt to climate change. Earlier, she served with the Global Environment Facility's Climate Change Adaptation Program, namely the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund. She's also worked at the World Bank on environmental international waters and integrated coastal zone management issues, and supported the World Bank's first corporate climate change strategy for the MENA region. So we are so pleased, Saliha, to have you with us and bring this important perspective to this discussion. How are international finance mechanisms like the Adaptation Fund, including women's voices, particularly women who are on the front lines of climate adaptation. And from your approach to the agriculture and energy sectors, can you give us some examples of interventions that have been most successful and impactful, particularly in the region in which you've been working, the MENA region?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It is really a pleasure to be here and an honor to represent the Adaptation Fund at this forum. The Adaptation Fund was created, just as a bit of a background, in 2001 under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, specifically Kyoto Protocol, but currently the Adaptation Fund serves the Paris Agreement, so the whole convention basically. And it is actually one of the only funds, an international climate fund, and the only UN FCCC fund that is solely dedicated to adaptation in all developing countries. Our projects are community-based, tailored to local adaptation needs, and driven by country ownership. Since 2010, the Adaptation Fund has committed a bit over $920 million to projects and programs around the world, about 130 or so of them. And this spans around 100 countries, including small island developing states, least developed countries. And it's serving about 36 million total beneficiaries. So when it comes to gender issues, this is something that has been at the forefront of even just very upstream thinking about programming, and it's reflected in our strategy, which sets advancing gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls as a core cross-cutting theme, which reaffirms that gender is an integral part of the Adaptation Fund's work. So that's what's on paper. And now I'm going to talk a bit about what that means and how it translates into practice. We recognize, the Adaptation Fund recognizes that climate change impacts and affects poor and vulnerable people disproportionately and the most. And among them, women are particularly affected as structural inequalities, especially since I would say structural inequalities increase people's vulnerabilities to climate impacts. Vulnerability to climate change is shaped by the capacity to adapt, to access resources, information, alternative livelihood options, and also by decision-making processes that impact the social distribution of resources or support. Now, women contribute to over 70% of the world's food production. It is, by some estimates, it is expected that by 2050, 70% of smallholder farmers will need to produce 70% more food than current production levels, but with the same or fewer resources. These are water, land inputs as today. There is yet another really strong rationale to increase efficiency and production, and therefore help promote adaptation to climate change through supporting women's empowerment and by using an integrated gender transformative approach. The energy sector specifically represents a major opportunity for gender equality. Renewable energy employs about 32% of women compared to 22% in the energy sector overall. The number of jobs in renewables could increase drastically from $10 million in 2017 to $29 million or more in 2050. And the ongoing global energy transition offers not only the chance to economically empower women, by creating employment, but also to reshape how energy is produced and distributed, strengthening women's resiliency and adaptability to climate change. And so in addition to all that, mainstreaming gender in climate adaptation is a matter of equity and fairness and a moral obligation for sustainable development and beyond. At the same time, mainstreaming gender is necessary to ensure the effectiveness and sustainability of adaptation efforts. As a climate finance mechanism created under the UNFCCC, the Adaptation Fund is tasked with upholding and delivering the mandate of gender equality. And so in support of these agreements and decisions in the international framework, the fund has instated and developed certain policies and accountability mechanisms to ensure gender equality is enhanced and mainstreamed across its investments. So we have lots of examples of how this is reflected in our projects. As I mentioned, we have over 130 projects or around that number all over the world in around 100 countries. And there are many examples of how this is done. The report that you're launching, and congratulations, by the way, on that excellent work, highlights one of the projects that has been supported by the Adaptation Fund. This is a project that has been implemented in Egypt by the World Food Program, one of our implementing entities. And it aims to build resilient food security systems in southern or upper Egypt region. So the southern Egypt is the poorest region in the country, where 45% of households live below the national poverty line. And it is expected that by 2050, southern Egypt could lose another, or at least 30% of its food production capacity due to climate change impacts. So the project aimed to improve the adaptive capacity of the southern Egypt region and build institutional capacity to enable sustainability and replication throughout the zone. What is notable about the project is that it has achieved an increased resiliency at the community level to climate variability and change by reaching 145,000 direct beneficiaries, of which 25% are women. The project reached over 26,000 women with small loans, and has trained over 29,000 women on risk reduction for livestock. But another positive effect of this project was the shift of cultural norms. Traditionally, women were excluded from certain sectors of the economy, but with the loan scheme aimed to diversify income sources, beneficiary women were able to save financial resources and set up small businesses. And so this has created a microeconomy within the project areas that are run by women. The project's in-kind loans for animal husbandry, for example, have had a particular significance for not only reducing poverty among women, but also empowering them as active agents of change. So I think I'm going to stop there for now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Saliha. That was excellent. And I think you made a strong case for why gender equality mandates in the adaptation funds are critical. And we can only hope that they will be fully implemented. But I think your examples in particular about what these investments represent, not just in climate adaptation, but also in terms of economic opportunity and more. So We'll come back to you shortly. We're going to turn now, we're going to go to Uganda and Constance Okollet. She's having significant difficulty with her technology, but I'm hopeful that she'll be able to come through. She is a farmer who serves as chairperson of the Osukuru United Women's Network, or OWN, where she leads a consortium of over 1,000 small women's groups working on education, community health, and comparable issues. She's been working tirelessly to organize and educate the women in her network on climate change, focusing on inclusive adaptation in agricultural practices and working to build community resilience. Constance, are you able to come in? Can you hear me?
Come again?
Let me ask you, you've been working to advance inclusive adaptation in agriculture across Uganda. What do you do in terms of your projects? Can you describe them for us and tell us what's been particularly impactful?
All right. I am the chairperson of Osukuru United Women Network. The network was started in 2007, and it was because of climate change. The climate change effects came about and spoiled, it killed people, it killed crops, it killed everything. At the end of the day, we saw that it wouldn't work for an individual, but if it as a group, we can work together and see the way forward of what we can do about the impacts of climate change. And that one, we formed a platform for the voiceless that is called the Osukuru United Women Network. And what are some of the issues that came about? There was floods. There was, after the floods, there was drought. After the continuous. So we said, if this issue is not being handled alone. So after starting the group, we started with the planting of trees. Which trees we are planting? We are planting all the food trees that will help us during the time of famine, that will help us during the time of during the hot season, that is the jackfruit, the avocados, all those fruit trees to help us with food, to act as food. And again, we said, let us bring our forests back. So we made sure that we plant tree, and we came up with a bylaw to say that we cut 1, 5 plus, plant 5 plus. So it's working, and we are doing, and we are changing the community to be as green as possible. We have the forest back. We conserve the wetlands, and we look what, and we make sure that they call it what, the floods, the droughts are reversed. The better call it what, to live in a better place than living in the other horrible times where you can't eat, you can't do what. Women walk long distance to look for water, and looking for water at the wells, when they wake up very late in the morning, they are abused. That is now either they are raped or they are defiled, these young girls. So such things, we made sure we said no. We shouldn't continue with this. Let us come together. We link with government. We work hand in hand with government. After lobbying, they can help us with some boreholes. They can help us with some quick maturing crops. They can help us with the tools, garden tools. They can help us with the many other things that can help us change our lives. Then after that, we say, let us do this with the group. And as a group, we have a savings group. Then after saving, we loan it out. After loaning out, we do our small scale businesses at household level, because there was a lot of gender-based violence, domestic violence. You find women being battered, you find women, girl child, such things, those bad things for the women and the girl child. So we saw that it is too much and we cannot accommodate it. Though it is climate change causing all this, we said no. We joined in sensitizing the community about gender-based violence, about community climate change and the impacts and how to handle it. And when we were starting, the men could say that the land is theirs. So we had to bring in the government workers, we had to bring in the liaison officer of police to sensitize the community and to tell them the goodness of planting of trees and planting of food trees. And even in the compound, we can plant it for the clean air and the clean energy that can help us to save our lives. Because during the floods, you find a lot of sickness, deaths. Children don't go to school, school dropouts, children getting pregnant, children producing a child. So those bad effects with climate change, we want to reduce it, and we make it, we completely finish off, and we say the world should change. Now, what the current speaker just spoken about the money that they have sent out to help women groups, to help. Okay, for us in the community, it's just a matter of ourselves, helping ourselves, because it is a self-help group. We are just helping ourselves to come out of the situation. We are struggling, and we know the women are the key the change agents. They are the key people who can change the world. Even if you want one, you come to the women will change the world to a better place to live in. Because in agriculture, they are doing a lot of planting of food, they are producing food, and at the end of the day, the food is supplied all over the world. So in the past, the men used to sell the food for the women. The men don't go to the garden, but you find after a woman doing the harvest, it is the man to take the food to the market and get the money. So that one, we are stopping it, and we are working around that to make sure that it is the woman who suffered with the garden. Let the woman sell her food, either buy a dress for the child, either buys a book for the child, or certain things that concerns home domestic requirements for themselves. But all that we are working. Look about decision making. Decision making, we are now making these women to be part of the home decision making, and of which it is working, and of which we want them to know that they are so powerful and they can even do better than men. But the only stress that they have is finances, to push them ahead of what they can do better or what they can do best. Because the little money they get, they save and loan it out, small money. But if they could get a better money, and at the end of the day, they can do better things than having these small tomatoes at the household, having this small fish, they call it small fish, the silver fish, and having making sure that they get to understand and to know the meaning of resilience and the meaning of how they can change their home. I think it would help them better with a bigger fund, because I heard the current speaker saying they have helped so many areas. For us, even going to the banks, we cannot, because we are so local. Most people don't reach us. It is only the sub-county chief that we can go and talk to, and they also help us with some, but it is not enough. The community is big, the group is big, and the money that the government has is very little. And another one is the policy. The policy makers are there, but we don't know about the policies that has come, which is there, which is not there. What about the policy? For us, we are working on our own and we are doing something and we want change because we said we cannot wait for other people to come and help us. It is us to help ourselves. So we are trying very hard to see to it that we help ourselves out of these problems and the climate change so that the world can change. We want the next generation to come because if you live and people die and at the end of the day, we shall be blamed. Even God will look at us as people who are not responsible. Then we shall be taken to hell, which is at the end you will suffer. Instead of suffering and ending here, then you have peace and rest in eternal peace. Tomorrow you will be questioned by God. So that one is part of the what? Because why am I saying all this? In the past when I was growing, there were forests. There were food all over. There were granaries. There were different types of food. There were 2 seasons in a year. The first season you could harvest, you could eat year in, year out, and the second season would be surplus for sale. There was no suffering like now. So I would just ask the people who are looking into communities, they should also come down to the community, come totally down to the community, not through government. Because if they come to my group, like we are going to Osukuru Women Network from Washington, they come down to Osukuru village, they sit around, they look, they talk to these women, they identify their problems, and even the solutions they will have to identify and help them better than putting in money through government, through those ones who know how to write proposals. But for us in the community, we don't know how to write a proposal. I've tried all our proposals, don't even go far. So we see there's no need for us to write proposals. When somebody comes to help, let him come. When somebody can come to see how we are gambling with the life and the world, let him come. But we say people should come and see us on the ground. I think I should stop there.
Well, thank you, Constance. And you have indeed given us a picture from the ground level, both in terms of the challenges that climate change has presented in the places in which you are working, but most importantly, how women are acting as agents of change in these circumstances through the agriculture practices they're employing, that's really leading to greater community resilience, despite how difficult life is. We're going to go now to our audience and to their questions. So hang in with us, Constance and the others, and we will take the first one up now with Allie.
Thanks, Milan. A couple from our policymakers on the line on the role of multilateral frameworks in all of this. The question is, what insight do you have on better integrating gender into national climate policies? And conversely, how can climate be better incorporated into gender policies, especially national action plans on WPS and the UNFCCC's gender action plans? Clara, do you want to start us off on that one?
Yeah, sure. I would be happy to. I think in terms of bringing gender into climate work, we have seen an uptick in gender integration in nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans, which is fantastic, although there's still a long way to go. And if we look at national action plans on WPS, currently about 1 in 4 national action plans make direct reference to climate. So again, this is a start, but there's so much room for improvement. Ultimately, the way I see it, I really think the key to meaningful integration is funding, which my fellow panelists have also emphasized. No matter the principles laid out in any of these strategies, if policy statements aren't actually backed up by financial commitment, whether that's for technical training or cross-agency coordination or budgets to implement policies, action risks being an afterthought. It's actually been reported that only 0.01% of funding worldwide supports projects that address both climate and women's rights. So country leaders really need to ensure that their policy statements are backed by financial commitments, and that is one of the key takeaways of the report. And just briefly, I want to emphasize Constance's point that these monetary investments won't be successful unless frontline groups can access the funds at the level that will be useful. Even if financial resources are allocated, they're often dispersed at too high a level and groups face barriers to access. So the bottom line is we need more funding for integration, for inclusive, gender responsive, local level climate adaptation. And we really need to ensure that this money is reaching women leaders at the grassroots.
Saliha, can you come in on this as well? I'm thinking about the role of political will too. We often have great policies with mandates on gender, and more often than not, they're not really implemented. What will it take to get better outcomes in this space?
Yeah, I think I can speak. So at the political level, I assume you mean the national political level, not the international.
Yeah, decision makers level.
Yeah, I think that, I think that the role of international financing institution is key there. I think we all have gender equality embedded in our mandates. And so it's really up to the institutions to translate that into policies and procedures and criteria that then govern the process of accessing funds from these funding institutions, such as the Adaptation Fund. I think for each project that is financed by the Adaptation Fund, first the request has to come from the country. It has to be endorsed by the country. We cannot tell country what to do. But once we receive that request, we have to put it through a thorough technical review, ensuring that it meets our criteria and that it abides by the Adaptation Fund's social and environmental principles, as well as the gender policy. So there's a very rigorous process at different stages of the proposal, because often we first get a concept, and then before the funding is approved, we have to have a fully developed proposal to review. And so if the proposal is not meeting the criteria, then we cannot simply recommend it for approval, and the board of the Adaptation Fund will not approve it. So this is the sort of a simple, kind of, not simple, but maybe the most impactful and direct way in which, yes, we are an agent in this very complex landscape. But then there are other things that we do, which is we train our implementing entities through work with on what it means, how to comply with the gender policy, and why. There's this soft, ongoing, it's a long game, working with agencies, working with people who are specialists in a particular field that's very relevant to climate change, but may need a lot of sensitization when it comes to gender issues, because that's simply not something they've really had exposure to professionally. And now this is an opportunity for them to grow, not just as professionals, but also as people. I'm speaking also from my personal experience, because I was not trained in, gender,
Right.
particular, theory or such, but it's obviously a part that affects every single person on the planet, regardless of gender.
No,
And-
it's a really important point, I think, that you're making in terms of the sensitization and the knowledge to be able to understand why it is critical and then to make it work. So thank you for that. Do we have another question, Allie?
Yeah, we have two here for Constance. One is from Jafet Eichel with the UN Department for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs Climate Security Mechanism, asking, how do you see climate change impacting gender-based violence, domestic violence, and conflict in your community? And then we have one more question for you, Constance, from Clara Tucci, asking, how can we, the audience, help groups such as OWN in formulating and presenting your proposals and requests for funding?
Constance, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm getting you. Now, the first, you just tell me the first question.
The first question is about how you see climate change impacting gender-based violence, domestic violence, and conflict in your community.
Oh. Hello.
Go ahead.
Hello.
Yes,
Yes,
we can hear you.
Hello.
Constance, we can hear you. Can you tell us about how gender-based violence is affecting your community?
Network is a bit poor now.
We'll go ahead and get her answers in writing and post them on our website, because I know that that is a topic of interest to many folks on the line.
I think she can't hear us, even though.
Okay, we'll do
So
that.
let's-
And then I have one last question if we want to close up with that, Milan.
Go ahead.
So two related ones. One is on the impact of public-private art partnerships, and then the other is how the private sector can play a greater role in the whole calculus of gender, climate, and conflict across all of your work.
Why don't we try to take that up with everybody? Clara, can we start with you?
Sure, yeah. So one of the recommendations made in the report is to leverage partnerships from all different stakeholders, and that includes the private sector. And just very briefly, in some of the projects spotlighted in the report, we see how the technical expertise of the private sector can very much come into play and help make stronger outcomes. So for example, the voice-based agro-advisory system in Gujarat, that was through a partnership with the private sector to actually develop that technology to help women get access to that information. So I'll stop there so my other panelists can weigh in.
Lydia, do you have any experience with other stakeholders, including the private sector?
Not yet. However, I have also received some recommendations from, friends who are in the private sector. And currently, I think a lot of private sector are beginning to think about having climate units within their organizations. And I think that this is a really good step, and thinking about biodiversity as well. And I think that this is a really good step, and one that I think that lots of private sector can begin to think about, and then start to think of how do they integrate lots of recommendations that have been shared, especially in this report and in this call. How can their activities be complemented with the values around climate change and climate action that they want to represent? I think that is one way to begin looking at it, and then developing very strategic partnerships, because I know that private sector activities might be very different from direct climate action activities. Just developing strategic partnerships with groups who are already working in that area. I think that would be a great way and a great direction to take for private sector.
Thank you. And Saliha, we will end this with you. Have many of the funds teamed up in any way with the private sector or other stakeholders? And do you have any experiences in that?
Well, I think, thank you for that question. It's a really important one. We are definitely trying to crack that nut. We definitely see the potential, and it has been happening. The reason I say is we're still working on it is because we feel that the potential is far from being realized. I think that the private sector is well aware that women, the potential of women as innovators, producers, and consumers everywhere is a business opportunity after all. But there are certain barriers that need to be overcome. They could be technical, capacity, cultural, so on and so forth. And this is, I think, where funds like ours can come in to step up and basically help bridge that gap. And I think that's what essentially we have managed to do with the example that I talked about earlier. So I'm optimistic, but yes, there's a lot of work to be done ahead.
Great. Well, let me thank each and every one of you. Thank Clara for the important work you've done on this report and more, to Lydia, to Constance. Again, I don't know if she can hear us, but we're grateful to her and the work she's doing, and to you, Saliha. We will post Constance's responses on our website to those two important questions. And I think it's very clear in the short time we've had today to be together that we see the importance of inclusive adaptation. It is a benefit multiplier to have women's meaningful engagement in all of these ways. So thanks to each of every one of you, to all of you who are listening. There is much work that we need to do to really address the existential threat of our time. Thank you all.